Biology, Mendelian genetics, and inheritance patterns. In this unit on heredity, we will discuss Mendelian genetics, named after Gregor Mendel, Punnett squares, visual tools of probability, non-Mendelian inheritance, dealing with patterns of inheritance that do not follow Mendelian genetics, inherited disorders caused by traits that are passed down, and pedigrees, useful charts that show family history of traits and the likelihood that these traits will be inherited by future generations. Mendelian genetics. Mendelian genetics occurs in organisms that sexually reproduce. Most eukaryotes reproduce sexually, fusing two gametes to produce an offspring. The process of fusing two gametes is called fertilization. Sexual reproduction increases the genetic variation in a population by creating genetically unique individuals. In this diagram, we see the fusion of two gametes. Genetic variation. If sexual reproduction creates genetically unique individuals, why do offspring still resemble their parents? In 1865, an Austrian monk named Gregor Mendel provided part of the answer to this question when he announced that he worked out the rules of inheritance through a series of experiments on garden peas. Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel was a monk who lived in an Austrian monastery. He had attended the University of Vienna, where he studied the natural sciences, as well as physics and mathematics. The monastery where he lived and worked was devoted to scientific teaching and research. In fact, a lot of the monks would go teach at the local school. One important aspect of Mendel's work was the formation of an agricultural society, emphasizing the importance of research that would help breeding programs become more efficient. A big question. Think about the following question as we study what Mendel did. What are the rules of inheritance that Mendel discovered? When we say inheritance, we mean things that are passed down from parents to offspring. Mendel's experiments. Mendel's experiments with pea plants were aimed at addressing one of the most fundamental issues concerning heredity. What are the basic patterns of heredity? Here are some important words to know for this unit. Heredity is the transmission of traits from parents to offspring. Trait: any characteristic of an individual, such as height, eye color, etc. And inheritance: traits that are passed down from parents to offspring. Two prevailing original hypotheses. At Mendel's time, there were two ideas to explain heredity. The first was called blending inheritance. This idea stated that genetic material from the two parents blends together. It was a widespread hypothesis with obvious shortcomings. An example of blending inheritance is that a red flower and a white flower will produce a pink flower. Then there was the inheritance of acquired characteristics. This idea stated that traits present in the parents are modified, and then through use are passed on to their offspring in a modified form. It was introduced as a theory by French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck in 1809. An example of this would be a giraffe that has a long neck because its ancestors kept stretching their own necks out to reach the leaves in the trees, and the long neck trait was passed on. Two prevailing original hypotheses. Blending inheritance hypothesis and the inheritance of acquired characteristics hypothesis were supported by some of the greatest scientists of Mendel's time. But were they correct? What are the basic patterns of inheritance? Mendel discovered the basic principles of heredity by breeding garden peas in carefully planned experiments. He was certainly not the first scientist to study how traits were inherited, but why was he so successful when others have failed? Model organisms. One of the most important reasons that Mendel was so successful is that he chose to study an appropriate model organism. A model organism consists of individuals that are usually small, short-lived, inexpensive to take care of, and produce many offspring in a relatively short period of time. That's very important, actually, and can easily be manipulated experimentally. What organisms can act as model organisms? Mendel's model organism, the pea plant. Mendel chose pea plants as his model organism because there are many varieties with distinct inherited traits, such as flower color. Controlled matings can be achieved with pea plants, and each pea plant has both reproductive organs, the pollen producing stamen, the male part of the plant, and the ovule producing carpel, or the female part of the plant. Cross-pollination, or fertilization between different plants, can be achieved by dusting one plant with pollen from another. That's seen in the picture on the right over here. There's a brush that's used to take the pollen from the stamen and brush it on the ovule. Controlled breeding of the pea plant. In order to precisely control his breedings, Mendel would cut the stamens off the plant to ensure that no unwanted sperm or pollen would touch the carpels, therefore it can't self-fertilize. And then he would use a paintbrush to apply only the specific sperm or pollen to the carpels. Mendel's chosen phenotypes. Mendel chose to track 7 characteristics that varied in an either-or manner. There were 2 forms for each trait. These observable traits of an individual are known as phenotypes. So the phenotype is the observable trait. Notice with these phenotype examples, it's either one or the other. For instance, it's either green or it's yellow, or it's violet or it's white, or it's round or it's wrinkled. There is no in between. Atypical experiment. In a typical experiment, Mendel started with 2 contrasting true breeding varieties. True breeding individuals will produce offspring that are identical to themselves when they self-pollinate or crossed to another member of the same population. So in the example on the right, we have yellow pea plants being crossed together, producing all yellow pea plants, and green pea plants crossing with each other, producing all green pea plants.